Hi, everyone behind me. Welcome to the meeting today. I'm just going to make a couple of quick announcements before we get on with our program that we're all looking forward to. First of all, our next movie will be Thursday night at 6:30, Weathering the Future. Weathering the Future is actually a Nova production. Some of you might have seen it, but come see it in the group because that's always more heartening and helpful that we're not all by ourselves with these problems. It's talking about extreme weather we know is happening with longer heat waves, more intense rainstorms, mega fires and droughts, and looking at how we are fighting back by marshaling ancient wisdom and also innovating new solutions. And then one of the things that I've been adding to the announcements is a couple of important climate actions that are coming up or that are actually ongoing. And one is a bill that is currently in committee. It's going through all the long, slow process that California and all governmental bodies do. The bill is a plan to divest pension funds for PERS from fossil fuel investments. You know, nothing talks like money, unfortunately, or fortunately. So we've got huge amounts of PERS funds, and I'll bet we've got a bunch of PERS members right here at this meeting. We need to divest both the public employees, the PERS and the state teachers retirement system from fossil fuel company investments. Also, there's an ongoing effort to get Costco to clean up its credit card because Costco uses Citibank as its credit card partner. Citibank has invested more than $332 billion in financing pollution. So they're really one of the dirtiest banks. More than 30% of Americans are Costco shoppers. I'm sure we have some of you here. And it's really important that we get them to change credit cards to a cleaner bank. And so sign the petition. It's very easy. One last announcement. I want to thank you all for your contributions towards our plan. We're partnering with the Auburn State Theater and our local store, the Farmers Marketplace. We're donating to a plan to show the sequel to Kiss the Ground, which is Common Ground. And Common Ground is following up on both the issues of American agriculture and moving to regenerative agriculture, and also moving our food system away from industrial and processed foods that are unhealthy for the soil, for our planet, and for our own bodies. Ken, would you like to come up and introduce Karen?
And our special guest is Karen Bigelow. Karen is the co-chair of Creation Justice Ministries based in Washington, D.C. They're an amazing organization. I'm on their mailing list and to get all kinds of fascinating information about the projects that they're working on. The one that I'm most familiar with is they are the partner with Bread for the World. Hopefully many of you have heard of Bread for the World, but they're really the world's leading hunger organization. And Karen's organization has a key role in making sure that our hunger decisions happen in a way that promote justice. So without further ado, we're pleased to turn it over to Karen Bigelow.
Hi, everyone. I am Karen Bigelow, a co-executive director at Creation Justice Ministries. As Ken said, we're based in DC, but we are a national organization. And I just want to take a moment to introduce the organization. So Creation Justice Ministries, our mission is to work with individuals, churches, congregations, and denominations to equip, mobilize, and train, educate people in order to protect, restore, and rightly share God's creation. And so our history, we are actually celebrating 40 years this year. We were originally a part of the National Council of Churches as formerly the Eco-Justice Working Group, and we represent creation care and environmental justice policies for many of the major Christian denominations throughout the United States. We work in cooperation with 38 national bodies, and actually I need to update that because we now have 39. The Cooperative Baptist Fellowship is now the 39th member of our body. And so the denominations all act as board members for us. And that representation ranges from Protestant denominations all the way to the Orthodox. So we really scan the spectrum of Christian representation with the exception of Catholics. We have nothing against Catholics, not sure why we don't have any Catholic representation at this point, but we're pretty much across the gamut of the Christian faith. And our mission to care for God's creation, and we see creation as being a part of the full ecosystem, including humans as a part of that. And so really wanting to do work of creating and protecting all of God's creation. So just to give a bit about myself, in addition to what Ken said, I have a bachelor's of arts in social relations and policy from Michigan State University. I have a master of divinity from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, and I need to update this. I'm actually now finished with my graduate diploma in global food security from the University of Edinburgh. And so that was a program that I was doing virtually. And for employment, I'm, as I mentioned before, currently the co-executive director at Creation Justice Ministries. And I am also formally a policy analyst, policy advisor, and project manager. I had a few different roles when I worked at Bread for the World, which is a great organization. And just a fun thing about me, I am also a beekeeper. And so I am going into my 4th year into beekeeping this next spring. And I also run online Beekeeping While Black, where I do work in order to just give more representation to Black beekeepers and try to create community. So I am going to go through the roadmap for my presentation for today. It's a lot of information, and so I'm going to try at moments to try to naturally take time for breaks, but I'm also going to try to leave some time for questions as well. And so today I want to go through some definitions just to make sure that we're all working with the same definitions. And then I want to give like an overview of what the experiences are for women and climate. And then I want to talk about the experiences of women in the US when it comes to climate, and then also talk about the factors that also drive issues for women internationally when it comes to climate. And then lastly, I want to talk about why we need women to be valued and better considered in our climate planning. And so that's the scope of where I'm taking you all today. And so definitions, for those, it sounds like you all are very well versed in doing this type of work, so I won't stay on this long, but climate change is a long-term shift in global measures of climate, such as precipitation, temperature caused by human activities that increases greenhouse gas levels. Its many effects include rising sea levels and prolonged heat waves. So one of those slides that I just wanted to show, again, I feel like you all probably already know a lot of this stuff, but one of the things I want to show is that we are having now more and more billion-dollar level of climate disasters or natural disasters that are causing billion-dollar destruction or damage. And so last year there were 18 events that happened that caused over $1 billion, and that doesn't include the amount of things that also happen, natural disasters that happen that weren't even causing $1 billion. And so the climate change is becoming very costly for us across the country. And it goes from a number of things, including droughts, hurricanes, tornadoes, deep freezes, and flooding as a part of that. And so this is just a scan for 2022, especially due to the level of heat that we had. I would not be surprised if 2023 will end up being worse once those numbers come out next year. The other thing to show is just for this graphic right here, it is able to show a bit of how things are getting worse, especially within the last few years. What we know is that from these climate events, they're getting much worse, especially in the last 5 years. On average, since natural disasters have been tracked and the cost that it has been causing, there used to be on average 7.9 events that cost $1 billion adjusting for inflation, on average since 1980 to 2022, for when the tracking happened. In the last 5 years, it's been on average 17.8 events that are $1 billion destruction. And so again, just to give some sense of the scale at which we are talking about of climate changes happening far more drastically and it really having an impact on our economy. So the next definition I want to talk about is equity. To be quick with this definition and to keep it simple, equity is fairness and justice. And so to show a graphic, I always think it's important to talk about the difference between equality versus equity. And so as you can see in this graphic, it really well illustrates the difference between the two. And so in the top half of the graphic, you see for equality, everyone in this graphic, all 4 people have the same exact bike. And what we see is that the first person is in a wheelchair. And so this person is not able to use the bike at all. The person who's next to her is too big for the bike. And so that's not really feasible to use. The third person in the graphic, the bike, is just right, kind of a Goldilocks effect. And then in the last bike, we see that the child is just too small for it. And so equity, and so equality is really about giving people the same input, but sometimes that means that giving everyone the same thing could actually not be helpful for everyone, as we see in the top graphic. Equity, however, is about giving people equal outcomes. And in that respect, that means that every single person in the graphic below has the level of bike that they need for what their needs are based on their size. And so equity is really about equal outcomes, whereas equality is about equal inputs. And equality does not mean that everyone necessarily gets what they need. So I like to define climate change plus equity equals climate justice. And so climate justice, this is a definition that I put together with a colleague in the past, and it's because we really struggle to find a good definition of climate justice. And so this is what we put together from our research time together when we were at Bright for the World. Climate justice is a practice that promotes equity by responding to the harmful impacts of climate change in ways that centers the challenges of historically marginalized groups, most particularly Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, who have and continue to experience historical systemic racism. And so in this, though, this can also be applied to women when it comes to climate. We know that women still have inequalities that they experience. And so in order to address the issues that women have, we really have to apply a climate justice lens, which means that we have to take into consideration the unique needs of women. Okay, so what's the problem when it comes to gender and climate? on a global scale, and this includes in the US as well, women are largely more susceptible to the impacts of climate change than their male counterparts. And so I'll go deeper into this issue, but here's the factors that drive the discrepancies that we see that women face. And those things include unequal pay, as well as then what leads to a wealth gap for many between men and women headed households. We also see an issue in housing options, and then lastly, patriarchy, or also social norms that can also get in the way. And so to sum it up, the challenges that women face on an everyday basis then lead to the worsening that women experience when it comes to the wake of climate change. And so I do want to give a disclaimer though, because as much as there's challenges for women when it comes to climate change, there's also the issue that is not talked about enough in the US. I'll just say in general, in the US, we do not talk about gender and climate enough. But to add a disclaimer, in the US, men are actually more likely to experience heat-related illness or death that is related to climate change, because men are more likely to be in occupations that are more likely to be outside. And so therefore they're exposed to issues like extreme heat more often, which is becoming a greater issue, as many, I'm sure, experience this summer, as an example. And so next, I want to talk about specifically women and climate in the United States. And so there's some major factors that make women more susceptible to climate change, and or the harms of climate change, and make it harder for them to cope in the wake of a natural disaster in particular. That includes one of those factors being the gender pay gap. In the US, 56% of those in poverty in the US are women. Additionally, almost 10 million US women live in deep poverty, which is defined as living below 50% of the poverty line. Almost 25% of unmarried mothers with children in the US also live in poverty. And so this is important to talk about income and pay gaps, because what we have seen in research is that often it makes it harder for people to cope with the impacts of climate change if they don't have the funds to do so. And so we have to think about the issues of poverty and conditions that make some people more likely to experience poverty. And so in the case of talking about women specifically, it's the pay gap that happens that often makes women more vulnerable. And so that matters because then it means that some women and their households that they head are less likely to be able to evacuate in a situation where they need to, if there's like a hurricane happening or so, or it may become harder for women to be able to afford air conditioning when you need to have air conditioning during times of extreme heat. And so there's moments where you need to spend more money for the sake of the safety of yourself and your household. And that's important. That's also important when we think about also older women as well, who in general, older populations are more vulnerable to climate disasters, especially when it comes to heat. And so we have to also think about what does that mean for older women to also then be more likely to be vulnerable to like heat issues and the lesser income that often happens as well. And so I'll also add, looking at this and putting a racial equity lens on top of the gender lens, the wealth gap between men and women is closing, but it's still there's a pretty good distance still. It's even lower when you look at the pay gap for women headed households that are Latino and Black. And so because of that, that means that this is an even higher issue that we have to worry about in the wake of climate for women of color, especially Black and Latino women. And so this can become a big issue. And so income, we have to consider who's less likely to have the income to be able to take the necessary steps in order to adapt to whatever the climate experience that they're having, because how we experience climate change in this country varies from one part of the country to another. What we also find is that women are more likely to be renters versus being homeowners. And so when it comes to housing being another factor, we have to consider too that there are far more protections in the wake of and after a natural disaster for homeowners than there are for renters. And so because of that, we also have to think about how are we maybe potentially exacerbating sexism through policy, because it's not considering who's renting versus who's owning and what resources people get as a part of that. And so this can become a big thing. And when I say who's getting resources, I'm particularly talking about FEMA. So this is not just like a who's getting charity. This is also like who's getting tax dollars in order to support their recovery after enduring a natural disaster. When we talk about housing too, again, to add the racial lens to it, BIPOC women are more, Black and Latino women in particular, are more likely to live in neighborhoods that have been redlined. And these are communities that have been very much without any type of investments for decades. And so they often are neighborhoods that don't have the infrastructure to properly withstand any serious natural disasters that happen. And then lastly, the other factor that I'll say for women is patriarchy being an issue. And so what research has found, I will also say there is not enough research around climate and gender in the United States. There's far more research internationally. And so it is hard finding statistics in the US. So therefore, unfortunately, the research that I have to cite is pretty old because it's just that sparse. But after natural disasters, it is far more common to see that the uptake in domestic violence or intimate partner violence, and also any other form of abuse, including sexual abuse against women and girls, goes up. Anytime there's moments of more distress and anxiety, it tends to increase. And so, for example, after Miami's Hurricane Andrew in 1992, spousal abuse calls increased by 50% in the wake of that. And so, unfortunately, when we think about the issues that women are facing, one of those things is having to think about the social norms that unfortunately in some households then put women more at risk. What we also find is that because women are more likely to default to their husbands for married or partnered people, they are more likely to also be left in natural disaster or in more dangerous situations in the wake of a natural disaster. Research has shown that men tend to be a little bit less averse when there's warnings, and women are more likely to listen to reports initially. And so because of that, a lot of women have been found to be in positions where they're actually more in danger because they defaulted to their spouse, who then wasn't as risk averse. And so because of that, sometimes they get left behind in natural disasters. And so when they could have evacuated safely days before or even a week before, they're then left having to deal with like the hurricane, for example, when it wasn't necessary. And so that's one of the things that unfortunately happens. And so those are the three main factors that my research has identified as like kind of big umbrella things when it comes to women and climate in the US. I'm happy to take any questions about that section before I move on to international women. Also, I'm also wondering if we have time to even go to that next section. If we don't, I'm happy to also come back and do a part 2, but I'm happy to take questions around women and about women in the US as a part of the conversation.
So just an observation, the problem that women have is largely a problem associated with being in poverty. And so I think you've made that connection. And I'd like to bring up one issue on poverty and climate change that you know more about and you might help me. And what I'm talking about is what I've read about called the cement jungle. And I read this stat, and it said that in an urban environment where it's the concrete cement jungle, that the temperature can be 20 degrees hotter than in the prestigious suburbs. And wow. And so it seems to me that, in terms of addressing that form of poverty, there's some cities like our cities here in Auburn and Grass Valley could initiate certain remediation for the cement jungle, and that would be a good ticket for promoting equity. Are you aware of any things along those lines?
Yeah, so I am gonna address the issue of like cement jungles, and how there's a discrepancy, especially when it comes to impoverished neighborhoods around the heat differences that many experience. So at Creation Justice Ministries, we actually did a campaign this past summer and a resource for churches to be able to share around extreme heat. And so that's a huge issue that has happened. And so unfortunately, in neighborhoods, I'm based in DC, and they found that in between the most, and DC is very small of a city. If you've ever been here, we don't have a lot of square footage as a city, and yet there can be as much as a 10-degree difference between one of the more affluent neighborhoods versus one of the least affluent neighborhood. And the main reason for that is because of trees. And so one of the ways that I think churches can really do more in order to help kind of address the discrepancy, because there's then health issues that come along with that. It costs people more to cool their houses and different issues like that. And it becomes even more dangerous at night for people when it comes to having that level of heat overnight. And so in particular, sorry, I'm losing my point real quick. But one thing that churches can do to help the situation is to be able to even help and support tree planting. Trees are able to not only improve environmental justice issues such as unclean air, it can also help with trees can absorb water better. And so it also helps as a mitigation to flooding. And in addition to helping to clean the air, it's also something that's able to help cool down the temperatures because of the shade that it provides. And so for churches, if there is like a practical step that you all want to take, I would say tree planting would be one of those things that can definitely help to address the inequity between when it comes to the temperature differences that many communities face.
So if the problem is that even in cities, more affluent regions get the trees, how do we make sure as a church that we're connecting with the right whatever to make sure that the trees go to where they need to be to help with this to help make it better in the places that are less affluent?
Yeah, so I have to find it, but the EPA and NOAA, there's some government resources that actually show where there's a gap in, they call them tree canopies. And so you can actually look at a city and see where there are trees and where there are not trees. And so I think part of that is partnering, for example, with churches that are in those communities that have the tree gaps. And so partnering with tree planting in that way. And so, because I think there's ways that churches can rethink how some have, more land than others, but how is church land being used, but then also how to work with local government to also get more permission to be able to plant on like the actual city grounds as well.
And I guess I'm wondering also, Karen, if you're familiar with funds that might help, because of course, most likely those are the churches that have the least financial resources, but are there any funds available that might help them with such a project if they decide to take it on?
Potentially, I'm not sure of nonprofits that are doing that right now. We've talked about it as Creation Justice Ministries. It's not a well thought out idea, but we thought about what if we had like some type of offset fund where people can do offset, can make donations in order to offset their carbon emissions. And then from there, that fund could be used to help community projects. And so we're playing around with the thought of, is there something like that that we could do? Um, and then there's also, it's competitive, of course, but there are federal grants that are coming out through the IRA that are helping to address tree planting opportunities. And so we did apply this year for it and did not win a competitive grant, unfortunately, with the US government. But the hope was to be able to actually help churches to do this type of work. And so we're hoping that next year, since it has 5 years to fund, to give out the money, we're hoping that there can be some state level projects that we can go after in order to help connect with churches. But we're also hoping that there may be some type of federal grants also that can happen. So unfortunately, I can't give a straightforward answer with where the funds are, because I think that's still kind of being decided at this point.
I have a couple of suggestions in this line. In
Mhm.
where we are, there are some civic organizations that are pretty oriented toward trees in particular, like the Sacramento Tree Foundation. Also, other naturalist groups, Sierra Club and so on, might be willing to come alongside a couple of churches or an association of churches to pursue compatible goals. So we need to think wider than just a church community or a city.
And I know actually, Ken, Winter, there's also our PECA, one of our PECA partners, has worked with a tree planting project in the Roseville area. And several of our members have gone out and participated in that. So as Ken says, it's also civic organizations
Mhm.
that are interested in this. So if you'd like to go ahead with the segment on international, women in international, I think that's a very important too.
Yeah, absolutely. So the conversation around women and climate when it comes to the international scale is far bigger of a conversation. It also needs more research, but it is far more well researched than it comes to women in climate in a domestic sense. And so to give some context, also this is where you're going to see my food security background come up in the conversation, because some of the factors are very much related to food systems. But 75% of people in poverty around the world rely on agriculture and natural resources to survive. And so that's important because climate change is threatening those resources. And so, how can you be a fisher and there's no fish or there's no water in the lake where the community farms or fishes, sorry. And also you need water in order to farm. And so there's so many, and temperatures are changing, precipitation. And so many people around the world are reliant upon the outdoors, nature, natural resources. It means that climate change is highly impacting the livelihoods of so many people around the world. And this is especially true for women. Women disproportionately bear the impacts of hunger, loss of livelihoods, and compromised health as a result of climate change. And so the majority of the world's low-income population are actually women. And these women are more dependent on their livelihoods related to natural resources. And so part of addressing climate change or the impact that women are facing means that women's agency is key to addressing climate change, not only tackling climate change, but also adapting to climate change. And so one of the ways that can be improved is really looking at how agriculture, land ownership, and resource management is handled. Because again, this accounts for a large population of women across the world. This is particularly true on the continents of Africa, Asia, and South America as well. And so some gender inequities that lurk beneath the surface, such as limited access to education, limited access to information, resources, job training, healthcare, and more, inhibit women's ability to combat natural disasters. And thus it makes women less likely to survive natural disasters than their male counterparts, as well as they're more likely to lose their income as a part of that, and thus also then being pushed more into poverty and hunger. And so when it comes to agriculture and land ownership, women often experience restricted land rights, and this is still a huge issue around the world. Women also experience a lack of financial resources. It's still in many cultures where women do not inherit the family's access to whatever resources can be passed down. It still tends to go to men, even though studies have shown that women are more likely to be the sharers in the community. And so when women have access to funds, it actually benefits the whole community. And women also tend to still lack access to training and technology, and also have limited access to political decision-making spheres, which prevents them from playing a full role in tackling climate change. And so women are key to attaining a sustainable food system and food production to ensure global food security, which the world is currently trying to achieve by 2030. But unfortunately, we're not on track because of issues like this. And so according to the UN FAO, women produce more than 50% of the food grown worldwide. Despite this fact, women still remain disenfranchised from receiving equality to their male counterparts when it comes to equitable resources around the issues of farming. And so not only is this issue around land, an issue around climate, it's an issue around livelihoods for women, but it also has a greater impact on communities and countries being able to have access to food. This issue, when we talk about land and women and climate, it's a gender conversation, it's a food systems conversation. It's so many issues that are tied into the issue of land access for women around the world, especially those who are farmers. And I also think about it as a Christian that we have a call to feed the hungry. And so if we are to do that type of work, that means we have to address the issue that women experience when it comes to land, because women are creating 50% of the food produced. And studies have also shown that if women had more land rights, that could actually be increased by another 30% that they could make. And so this is a huge issue that if we help women to combat and to adapt to climate change, it would actually not only help when it comes to the planet, but it would also help to the food security of so many communities. And so women internationally face barriers at the household level. This is true in the US as well as abroad in their communities and through policies, which prevents women from fully being able to participate in sustainable production of food, despite having such a strong presence in the food market and food systems. And so, as I said before, women are around half of the farmers globally. In Asia and Africa, they're around 43 to 47% of farmers. And then also 45 to 80% of all food production in low GDP countries are produced by women. So some countries as much as 80%. So that's really most of the food that is produced. And yet again, women still face struggles when it comes to agency around their livelihoods and land ownership and access to education in order to improve their farming practices. And so again, as I was saying, if women get access to the same amount of resources and education as men, food production by women would increase by 30%. At that rate, around 150 million less people would experience hunger globally.
Well, I just was wanting to ask you, or is your organization taking some active steps? You're giving us incredible information, but to actually, in some way, increase the rights of women internationally in these food production, in basically land rights is what I'm hearing. How can we help to increase their rights so that they do have that opportunity?
Yeah, so unfortunately for Creation Justice Ministries, we are currently only domestic. In our policy, we do plan to move internationally. However, we have to build the capacity for that. So right now we're not doing anything. I would highly suggest going to an organization like Bread for the World, who does both international and domestic policy around hunger. They had this great hunger report that came out in 2016, I believe, the hunger report then. No, sorry, 2015, they had a hunger report that was when women succeed, communities thrive. It was something around that, but it was around women and hunger, and it really talked about this issue in particular. The statistics may be out of date, but I think the themes that the report talked about are still very much relevant because unfortunately not a lot has happened when it comes to this issue. But there's also advocacy that can happen with the US government. The US has a lot of influence around international policy. And so there's ways in which our programs in the US can do far more to really invest in women, especially because there's a lot of US programs that actually help support farming and other practices in a lot of low GDP countries. And so because of that, Food for Peace, I think, is one of the programs. There's also another, I'm forgetting the name right now, but there are programs in the US that actually do help. I'm sorry, that the US helps abroad that helps with farm management and other things. And so the US could actually add more of a gender equity lens to the policies that it has that are abroad. And that's personally from my perspective in that respect. And so another issue or factor that impacts women as well, or driving factor, is resource management. That can be a challenge when it comes to climate. It is well documented that rural women in particular play a key role in environmental and natural resource management. Women's active involvement in agriculture makes them key stakeholders in effective environmental management. And hence, when women are not being treated as key stakeholders, it means that a lot of resources could go to waste, or that they're not being stewarded as well because there's a lack of education, or also because there is just not enough agency that they have to really be able to better steward resources. And ironically, women have a wealth of knowledge as well when it comes to adapting to climate change, but because they're not being treated as key stakeholders in responding to climate change, that also means there's a lot of knowledge that is not being shared. And so it's kind of a double-edged sword where it's not beneficial to anyone for women not to be included in the conversations around resource management, especially when issues like water are becoming even more scarce in many countries. And the last factor that I want to acknowledge for women internationally is social norms. In the same way that we talk about patriarchy when it comes to women in the US, social norms is a big component of why women have limited agency around issues around climate and their livelihoods. And so women in many countries are often responsible for gathering and producing food, collecting water, and sourcing fuel and heating. And so because of those social norms, it can make it harder for women to be able to adapt to climate change because they're having to spend so much time trying to do the basic home needs. And so that includes like collecting water, which for some women is, and girls, this is a conversation around women and girls of all ages. This is becoming a bigger issue where many are not able to go to school because they have to spend so much time walking in order to collect water. And so this can be a huge issue. And we also find with social norms that can be a hindrance to climate and other issues is that when natural disasters happen, women are more likely to die after a natural disaster internationally in many of these countries because there's a norm that when something happens, women are the ones who have to take care of the children and those who are disabled or senior who are unable to evacuate. And so because of that, that means a lot of the times these populations are left more vulnerable to unsafe situations, are more likely to be exposed to overcrowded shelters or camps. They're more likely to just be left without resources. And so this can have dire consequences to the health of women and girls in particular. And so when it comes to like death rates internationally because of during natural disasters, because of some of the social norms that happen, women are 14 times more likely to die than their male counterparts during a natural disaster. And so as there's policies that need to happen, there also needs to be consideration for how can policies also counter some of the social norms that happen and be able to do what I like to call population sensitive responses, because they have to consider how women and the norms around women and what they're responsible for needs to be considered in any type of disaster planning. In order to make sure that more women are safe. And so all of that is the context of the international. And so I think it's important that to also think about why women need to be valued and considered in climate resilience. Part of that is that studies have shown that women are the carriers of community and culture. And so therefore, when it comes to addressing and adapting to climate change, it's so important for women to be in that conversation and to be respected in that conversation, because they know people. They're more likely to have the relationships with people in their community. They're more likely to take care of people in their household and community. And so when women are given the space to really be leaders, it's not just good for that woman, it's good for the community. There also needs to be the fact that women are more risk averse statistically. And so because of that, that means that women are probably actually more adapt to disaster planning because they're more like in households, because they're more likely to actually listen to the science first. And so because of that, that would actually mean that less people are being put into dangerous situations that are avoidable because they're more likely to actually follow it. And I usually don't like to talk in like broad terms like that, but unfortunately that is where the research has shown to be the case. And so what we find is that by women not always having the resources needed or having the agency to be listened to, that means that often there's stuff happening that doesn't have to happen. And so I think that's important to consider both in the domestic sense and the international sense, why that needs to be a part of the conversation. And also, I think there's certain things that there's a lot of policy that needs to happen. For one thing, we need more research to be done. We also need policies from agencies like FEMA to consider the unique needs that women have. One thing that, for example, is not always considered is what does it mean for women to have access to sanitation, like feminine hygiene products that are at the sites when there's a natural disaster and people have to go to, you know, some type of gymnasium or some type of stadium or something. Are there products for, you know, women on their periods, for example? Are there places where women and resources to help nursing mothers to be able to do things? And so there's just more things that can be considered to uniquely plan and how to be able to support women when we're talking about disaster responses. And also, again, knowing that women are more likely to be in poverty or to not have the same level of resources as male counterparts, how are there more consideration for women-headed households in order to make sure that there are the resources there that they may not have? And so how are we planning to make sure that women are able to, you know, get out safely during a disaster, or being able to have the resources to be able to plan properly when there is some type of natural disaster happening? And so unfortunately, we don't do that currently in our disaster planning. And again, when it comes to international and domestic, there's just not enough research and there's not enough planning for gender as a part of that. And there also needs to be the conversation, as I said before in my disclaimer, is that there's no consideration for even what does that mean for men to be more likely to be indoors, and how do we support men in that way for like heat related illnesses. And so just to finish off, some of the things that I think that churches can do. Number one, it sounds like y'all are already doing stuff, but advocacy. I always feel like the work of the church is incomplete if it does not include advocacy. There are bills right now that address gender and climate. Sometimes they can be a little bit of a controversial bill, but there's been a few members of Congress who have tried to introduce, and it has never gone anywhere, women in climate bills. We also have bills that can help, such as an extreme heat one. Right now, FEMA is not allowed to respond because extreme heat is not considered a natural disaster currently. By definition. And so therefore, it's as simple. There's a bill that's currently out. It's literally a 3-sentence bill that would just say that FEMA could consider extreme heat as a bill or as a natural disaster. And then it means that FEMA can actually respond to the earlier point. And so there's so many advocacy points that need to happen in order. I would also say the IRA, it is a okay start, but it's not enough. I'm glad that the US finally had more climate funding. However, it also created sacrifice zones. And so there's so many communities, especially Black and Indigenous communities, that unfortunately this bill is allowing to become sacrifice zones in the wake of climate natural disasters. So unfortunately, there's communities that will feel the impacts. And so that's the type of policy that we have to undo. With the IRA, we also need more investments in infrastructure. I know that it's on its way and it's coming, but it will not be enough. And part of the challenge is that a lot of infrastructure that's being built is based upon past patterns of natural disasters. And so it considers, for example, at what level have hurricanes happened in Florida in the past, where it really needs to be considering what is the future of hurricanes going to look like in Florida. Often it's based on the past as opposed to the coming issues of climate. And so there's so many things policy-wise that need to happen. And so it sounds like y'all are already doing advocacy. So just some more things to consider. And for Creation Justice Ministries, we send out actions that people can take on a monthly basis around not just climate, but also conservation issues. For example, we're doing a Christmas tree ask when it comes to protecting forests for December, but we also do environmental justice ask as well. And then also I would say, as you as a church consider how you're going to address climate change, consider things like tree planting, but also how can your church actually serve as a facility in the wake of climate change? How can you help when there's climate shocks that happen, these climate events happen? How can you respond and let your church be a hub to respond to that with people in the community, or people, or even partner with other churches, so that, let's say your church is at a higher level in the city and there's an issue of flooding, then the churches that are at that lower level can then partner and be able to be a funnel, over. And so there's so many things that churches can do. And part of that is also considering the populations that are more likely to have the need. And so again, as I mentioned with like how disaster planning is at the federal level, you can also think about how do you have like sanitation products for women and like, if you're to house people for a long term in the wake of a natural disaster, how can you support women who are more likely to experience domestic violence in the wake of a natural disaster or some type of event that would cause more stress in a household? There's also, and the same can be true for other there's so many populations that need to be considered, but part of that is really more than anything, how can communities that are more likely to experience poverty, that includes BIPOC communities, but that also includes certain women, women who also live in poverty. There's different communities, disabled communities, Communities are more likely to live on fixed income, which would be disabled or those who are retired. And so thinking about how can we really make sure that we're addressing the needs of people who are less likely to have the income to be able to deal with these emergency situations that happen, especially in this economy when inflation and all these other things are so bad right now. So I'm going to stop talking now. I don't know if we have any more time, but I'm happy to have more conversation and questions with everyone.
Well, thank you, Karen. Let's get. So you can hear a lot of appreciation, I think. We'd like to get your list of actions we can take and advocate for. And I'll
one-
just add some of those to the.
Yeah. And we do advocacy, but I'll also add we are doing more and more trainings. If you have any youth groups in your church, we actually do have a few sites that actually we have a program called Blue Theology that teaches kids in particular about their faith while also teaching them about the science around ocean conservation and how to hold like your faith and science together. And so that's middle school and high school ages. We are also looking, and so we do have a site in particular. I'm forgetting there is a California site, but I'm not remembering it right now what city it's in. But if you do have any youth groups who would be interested in that, we also do theological reflection. We realize that there is not enough theological resources and opportunities. And so we actually during this Advent season are doing a theme called Witness with Creation, where we're looking at how all of creation played a part in witnessing the birth of Christ. And so we like to do themes and to do theological reflections to help really put together the issue of faith and creation care. And then lastly, I'll add that every year we have our Earth Day Sunday theme. This year's theme was around agriculture and food, and next year's theme will be called Plastic Jesus. And it will be around the issue of plastics in the US and talking a little bit about the international conversation as well. And so that will be released sometime in late January, we're planning. And so it will have theological ask, but it will also have the resources necessary if you ever wanted to do a Earth Day service. And so we actually had music commissioned for a songwriting retreat in order to have like actual theological grounded creation care music, and as well as have prayers and other resources as well, and sermon starters and Bible study starters as well to be able to use as a resource. So just to promote my organization, but there's far more resources that we also have that may be of interest.
Thank you. Yeah, we need to look at your website and keep that in front of us too. So thank you so much, Karen. We really appreciate all the time and appreciate your patience with our technological glitches. But I think you came in very well and clearly, and we could hear and see you. So
Linda,
really appreciate it.
Linda?
Yes. We have a person on Zoom. Hi, Shirley.
We have Shirley,
didn't know you-
yeah. Hey, you know what? Maybe I just haven't paid attention enough, but what is your organization, Karen? You're so articulate, and I'm particularly perked up when it comes to plastic. And so tell me what your organization is and what's that about?
Yeah, Creation Justice Ministries is our organization.
Creation Justice Ministry. I got to write that down. Interesting. Okay.
This year we're celebrating 40 years. We have an amazing service on our YouTube with Dr. Ben Chavis as a part of spoke at our service that we held. And he is the person who led one of the fathers, as they call him, of the environmental justice movement. And so he came and spoke, and it was a beautiful service with choral pieces and everything. So if you want to go and watch that, but we've been around for 40 years. We were a part of the National Council of Churches. And we, for the last 10 years, have been what is now Creation Justice Ministries. And we're a small but mighty team that's still very much growing. And yeah, next year we'll be focusing on the issue of plastics in particular for our work. And so It's really going to be a theme that's related to conservation issues, but also around environmental justice issues and what that means for human health as well.
I think that might be all the comments for today, so anyone else wanting to say something before we say goodbye to Karen?
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.